and I'm the chair of the APA's New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, April 13th, and we will be hearing the presentation, Hurricane Matthew, Finding the Silver Lining Through Mitigation and Disaster Recovery. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or you can call that 1-800 number shown. And for your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, again located in the webinar toolbar. And we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And if you have a question for a particular panelist, please state which panelist you would like to answer the question when you're typing it in. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2018. Thanks to all the participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we just ask that you reach out to them and suggest that they join us. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Virginia chapter of APA, and you can learn more about them at virginia.planning.org. And you can learn about all of our divisions by visiting planning.org/divisions. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. To register for these, just visit our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And there's 4 listed up here now, and we have actually many more down in the pipeline. And some of those are even listed on our webcast webpage now as pending, but you can at least mark it down on your calendar. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account. And from there, you can search for CM activities by either typing in the title of today's webcast or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education. Just head over to our webcast webpage and you can see a list of our law and ethics sessions that are available for distance education and links to all the information you need to view them and to log them for credit. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And we are recording today's webcast. Just head over to YouTube and type in Planning Webcast, and you can view a recording there. We'll also have a PDF available of the presentation at the conclusion today on our webcast webpage, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it over to today's presenters. Michelle, take it away.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
All right, great. Give me just a moment here. I'm going to get started. All right. So thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon. We want to take some time to talk to you about Hurricane Matthew and some of our experiences. I have a list of panelists today. Right here you can see the names of everyone who's participating, and I will be providing contact information on the last slide. So in addition to being your panelist today, I'm actually going to be your moderator as well. We're going to start with Virginia Department of Emergency Management with Robbie Coates, who's going to kind of set the stage a little bit for what happened during Hurricane Matthew, a couple of days pre-landfall, and kind of focusing on what the response of the state was. And then we're going to turn it over to FEMA, and we're going to start with Charlie Baker from the National Flood Insurance Program, who's going to be talking about some of the disaster impacts and broader implications, how it impacted communities and some of the bigger issues that we face as we respond to the disaster. Then we're going to have Mari Radford, who works in our risk analysis branch here at FEMA. She's going to be talking a little bit about some of the tools and incentives that you can use when addressing flood planning and a little bit about recovery planning and some of the partnerships that are involved. And then I'm going to be presenting with my colleague Kevin Snyder, and we're going to be talking about recovery planning. We're going to be sharing with you some examples focusing on Virginia in particular and the structure in Virginia. And then I'm going to be giving you a little bit of information about some resources and toolkits, and then we're going to take some questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Robbie, and we are going to get started here with Robbie Coates.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michelle. So as Michelle stated, my name is Robbie Coates. I'm with the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. And, when we had Hurricane Matthew was being forecasted by the National Hurricane Center, this is just a snapshot of what the forecast looked like on October 4th. And for those of you familiar or may not be familiar with the kind of cone you see on the left-hand side, this is basically, 2/3 of the time the hurricane manages to stay within the cone, but there's a third of the time where the uncertainty is outside of the cone. So as you can see, the further out you get, the larger the cone becomes. But you can see the far southeast corner of Virginia is starting to creep into the cone at this point. We in Virginia started our preparedness activities way in advance. About 10 days out, we started our planning, our discussions, checking resources, looking at our plans, especially when it comes regard to evacuation planning. Because at this point, Matthew was looking, I think it was a category 4 or 5 at that point. And so we always have to be on the err on the side of caution and planning for the worst this far out because of the uncertainty. If you look at the image on the right, this is kind of a summation of all of the forecast models for this particular storm. And as you can see, it's just really kind of all over the place. It's looping, it's going out to sea, it's going into the Gulf. So we really couldn't rule out any potential impacts for Virginia. So that's why we decided, we go ahead and activate our Emergency Operations Center and start with the planning. So this was October 4th. So Michelle, next slide, please. So here's 4 days later, where the current storm is located, is that little orange dot at the tip of the cone. And it's looking like it's going to, brush up against South Carolina coast, kind of right along North Carolina, south part of North Carolina, and then just kind of circle back out to sea, and eventually come back into the Caribbean. So at this point in time, we were feeling a little better about the forecast in Virginia, but still understanding that, a third of the time this could be wrong. And so on the right-hand side, you can see too the forecast track, not as wildly crazy as how it looked on October 4th, but still you could see how so much uncertainty still revolved around this storm. So we were still planning on some type of impact in Virginia. But at this point in time, the forecast was, we might get 2 to 3 inches of rain in parts of our coastal area in Hampton Roads, or Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and some of our other friends in Hampton Roads. We're going to get like 2 to 3 inches. So overall, our expected impact was going to be minimal for this event. Next slide, please. So we are strong partners with our folks over at NOAA and the National Weather Service, and this particular storm had so much uncertainty that when they were calling for 2 to 3 inches at the 5 a.m. forecast that day, a lot changed. Obviously, the rain bands moved a lot further north than was originally anticipated. So by 6 p.m. that night, we got a really cryptic message from the National Weather Service, and I had to read it a couple times because, as you could read here, they don't use language that is typically this strong unless they feel very strongly that there's going to be something significant. So, if you scroll down here in the second paragraph, there is a reference to Hurricane Floyd, which really kind of opened my eyes. A little background too, I serve as the plans chief in the Virginia Emergency Operations Center. What that means is I oversee a team that basically puts together products for situational awareness. So what's happening, how bad is it going to be, and what are some of the needs we're going to have. And so I was actually on call during this time, and when I saw this, I immediately reached out to our coordinator for our team and was like, "Hey, did you see this? We should be concerned." By 9 o'clock that night, we were in the EOC, and we had gotten reports from parts of Southeast Virginia that many roads are impassable. There was up to 14 inches of rain had fallen. So from our perspective, the morning of October 8th, it looked like we were going to get 2 to 3 inches of rain, and by 6 p.m. It was like it caught a lot of people off guard because of the dynamic evolution of the storm. Next slide, please. So when we heard Hurricane Floyd, we were really concerned because parts of Southeast Virginia and definitely parts of more so Eastern North Carolina this was like their storm of record. And so with Hurricane Floyd in the city of Franklin, which is close to the coast but inland, this is river flooding from the Blackwater River. This is really immediately what jumped to our mind in Virginia is, wow, like Hurricane Floyd reference. This is serious, and we didn't take that with a grain of salt because we know that National Weather Service, wouldn't put that language in there if they weren't trying to get people's attention and try to act. So you can go to the next slide, Michelle. So part of this process was this event happened kind of when we were coming out of the tail end of a reorganization within the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Our agency was divided into two bureaus, a Disaster Services Bureau and a Mission Support Bureau. And during this time frame, we had a lot of new people, new people on staff. And on the Mission Support Bureau side is where our Recovery and Resilience Division and our Finance Division, which you see CFO, our Chief Financial Officer. As a part of this reorganization, our grants were kind of consolidated from piecemeal within the divisions which the program fell, and they were consolidated into one grant shop under the Chief Financial Officer. So those of you familiar with recovery and public assistance and hazard mitigation grants, those kind of came out of the recovery division and kind of got put under the centralized grant office. While the Recovery and Resilience Division is more along the lines of the programmatic outreach education, as well as leading the charge when recovery comes in terms of priorities and dealing with some of the other issues like the long-term housing and other effects of recovery. So we have this new organization. I do want to make another point on the left-hand side of your screen. You'll see we have Regional Support East and Regional Support West. In the past, within our 7 planning regions, we had one person in each region that basically was the state's coordinating person with the localities and state agencies in that region. As a part of our reorganization, Dr. Stern, our state coordinator, wanted to really beef up our regional presence and make the regions kind of the front door to the agency, so to speak. So each of our 7 regions now has at least 4 people in them. One of them is the Chief Regional Coordinator, which oversees all of the functionality of the region. And then each region has an all hazards planner that reviews and assists localities with developing all aspects of planning, from hazard mitigation plans to emergency operation plans. We have 2 nuclear power plants in Virginia, so they do radiological planning and the whole gamut of all hazard plans. And then there's a hazardous materials officer in each region. And then there's a disaster response recovery officer, which is really kind of the point of contact that's going to be there, boots on the ground with the locality, trying to make sure that all the coordination's there with needs. So I just wanted to set the stage with that. We also had a lot of new folks really across the board in each of these divisions that you see here. You can go to the next slide, Michelle. So after the event, there was a big push to get people out in the field and do what's called preliminary damage assessments. So typically what will happen is the locality or state agency will send us their preliminary cost figures for this particular event. And usually the initial damage assessment is just a ballpark number. And then if we feel like it meets the threshold requirement for federal assistance, then we'll reach out to that locality and coordinate, if it's warranted, an on-site preliminary damage assessment, or if it's something that they can provide over through email. If it's not really site related, then we'll go through that process and validate and see if there's enough damage there for a federal declaration. We sent out several teams. I believe we had 10 teams total, 5 for public assistance and 5 for individual assistance. And individual assistance is to assess the number of residential structures and businesses impacted. Generally, you'll have a state representative, a local representative, a FEMA representative, and someone from Small Business Administration, because they can provide low interest loans after an event to speed up the recovery process. But this was the fastest we had ever done damage assessments. What the goal of our agency is to really build capacity with a lot of new people on staff. And so everyone kind of got thrown out in the field from every single division. We had our grants accountant out doing damage assessments. We had our IT department out. We had, basically all the support functions. We had folks out in the field, and they were done within 2 weeks of the disaster. It took some time with some follow-up validation, but that was pretty monumental for our agency to be able to get the damage assessments done that quickly with all this new staff we had. For those of you who aren't familiar, we have to ask for a declaration request to the president. It has to come from our governor within 30 days of the event. So the timing is really crucial with pulling this information together and making sure we have our documentation together. The last bullet here, you'll see we had our Recovery and Resilience Division Director actually started the day after Matthew hit, and so on his second day on the job, he was on a Black Hawk helicopter with the governor. And I always joke with him about that. He really literally got thrown into the fire, so to speak, for that incident. Go ahead, next slide. So, for those of you who are familiar, after the president declares a federal disaster declaration, typically what happens is a joint field office is opened in the general area of the impact of the disaster, where primarily federal agencies led by FEMA, as well as our state agencies, are able to basically coordinate and navigate all of the needs and assistance associated with the disaster. So one of the things that we also changed with this process was initially we would surge up with staffing to support the JFO. With this being kind of in terms of size, kind of a low, moderate end disaster where we felt like we had the staff, even though we had a lot of new staff, it was an opportunity to really build capacity within our agency to be able to support the Joint Field Office as well as for future federal declared disasters. We utilize both our public assistance staff and hazard mitigation grant administrators to support the public assistance program with the site visits, the writing project worksheets, which are basically grant applications, and our chief financial officer actually ran the IA program from the JFO for a period of time. So we had a lot of different people working the disaster. People were working 1 week assignments, getting rotated in and out. So we had our planning division was rotated in and out doing the operation planning, the incident action plans. We had our logistical people, external affairs was rotating in and out. And in the past, we had maybe 10 people or less that would basically go to the JFO and work like 3 to 4 months there. And then, they'd come back and kind of transition back. But the other people in the agency weren't really exposed to that, that environment. So this was really, really good for us in general at VDEM to build that capacity. Go ahead, next slide. Just a little background information. So we had an emphasis on this disaster to typically the federal funds with public assistance is for rebuilding the impacted infrastructure to where it was before the disaster. And so 406 is basically the code reference in the Stafford Act, but this allows for taking measures to, while we're repairing this, let's do something to prevent this from happening again, so we're not continuing pouring money into repairing this type of issue. So if you look at the bottom, so for every dollar in PA spent, the national average is 3 cents on a dollar in preventing future risks. So these are some of our recent federal declarations over the, since 2011. So as you can see with Matthew, we're pretty much on mark with the national average, where some of the other ones in the past haven't been there. But our goal is to really, and FEMA's goal too, is to really invest more in identifying these opportunities moving forward. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of non-insured structures, and you'll see through the rest of this webinar, there'll be more details on the impacts on structures insured and not. But this was an event that, risk wasn't clearly identified because it wasn't in a FEMA mapped floodplain. It was really a storm drainage issue. The Hampton Roads area is generally flat, and when there is a heavy rainfall, the water tends to sit. And if you couple that with high tides and storm surge, the water actually can't drain out into the Chesapeake Bay. So it's a challenging area down there, but there wasn't really an awareness that this could happen here. And what we learned from the damage assessment process and some of the homeowners coming out, they'd lived there all their lives and never had an issue with flooding. And so all of a sudden they have 2-3 feet of water in their house, which was very significant for these folks. And again, like this, on a much smaller scale, this is kind of what happened with Hurricane Harvey, where you had an historical amount of rainfall in one location, and it really doesn't, from that much water in that short amount of time, the water obviously crept outside of the mapped floodplain, and the understanding of risk wasn't there, but now it definitely is. But that was an event that probably won't happen again in many people's lifetime, but it still brings that awareness and communication of risk, which is important to understand. Even though you're not in a mapped floodplain, it doesn't mean that you can't flood. So next slide, please. So, as part of this process, we were running the hazard mitigation grant program. Some of the challenges with the grant program with this particular disaster is that we can do buyouts of flood-prone properties if they're declared by a local government that the structure is substantially damaged, which means that 50% or more of the value of the structure itself is basically in cost and damage. Then they could declare it substantial damage. And then we could apply for federal funding to purchase and demolish that house, they would get fair market value for the house. And then we wouldn't have to determine the cost effectiveness, which is typically through historical damages or having elevation certificates, understanding how high the first floor is with respect to the 100-year flood depth. So that was a challenge. Another thing too is back to risk is when we know a structure is located in the floodplain and we have data on from the flood maps of how high that water will be for a 100-year event, it's a lot easier to determine based on how high that structure is what the future impacts will be based on FEMA's benefit cost analysis tool. Well, if you don't have that, you're really reliant on the property owner actually keeping records on how often it floods and how much it costs. And so, you know, not many people are, after something floods, are, you know, thinking about a future grant to apply for. So that can be, that's a really challenge we see here in Virginia. And the fact that they're voluntary programs is, I think, challenging from a local level because locality might have plans to, you know, of what they want the community to look like post-disaster. But at the same time, these programs are voluntary. So if the homeowner wants to stay, there's nothing anyone could do about it. So that can be a challenge too. But I think it's in place for reasons so that local governments can't come in and basically, you know, do eminent domain and force people to out of their homes too. So that's something that, you know, is a challenge to navigate as well. And then we can have projects that get awarded and then property owners decide to drop out. And so you have to make sure that when applying for hazard mitigation grants with residential structures that you have a substitution list where you can plug in another property to take the place if one drops out. One of the other things I just want to kind of tie this together with is the timing of federal assistance. So public assistance, when we're writing these grants, and FEMA's really a big supporter of this, when we're writing these grants for public assistance, they happen fairly quickly, typically within the first like 90 to 100, you know, 3 to 4 months after a disaster. And so when you're trying to marry up opportunities to do hazard mitigation measures with the hazard mitigation grant program, which applications don't have to be submitted until a year after the event, it's hard to sync up those opportunities. I know at the federal level and state level, we're looking to try to find opportunities where we can better work that in, but that is a challenge moving forward. Next slide, Michelle. And that's going to wrap it up for me. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Our next speaker is Charlie Baker. Charlie works with the National Flood Insurance Program here in FEMA Region 3. And take it away, Charlie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to discuss the impacts and implications of Hurricane Matthew. There are two key takeaways from this that we all need to remember and, more importantly, convey to the public. That is, flooding occurs outside the special flood hazard area, and it costs a lot of money for a community to get back to normal. So let's look at some of the facts of the impacts. The storm hit, as Robbie said, in the heavily populated areas of Chesapeake, Hampton, Newport News, Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Virginia Beach. These areas received 3 to 14 inches of rain in 34 hours. So of these impacted areas that were declared, there were 2,261 approved individual assistance applications. Total individual and household program dollars obligated were approximately $10 million. This money went directly to affected citizens. Public assistance grants totaled approximately $15 million, and some of these grants were awarded to the state and local governments for replacement of publicly owned utilities and infrastructure. These monies totaled $25 million. This does not take into account how much money was paid out in insurance claims. This means families, businesses, local and state government all become financially cash-strapped to deal with the hardships brought on by a disaster. Okay, this map shows the structures that were impacted by the Hurricane Matthew. Notice there are a lot of structures not in the special flood hazard areas, but how many? Roughly 70%. So 70% of individual assistant registrations were owners outside of the special flood hazard area. This means these individuals more than likely did not have flood insurance, which is available to them, and may have incurred significant losses to their homes and businesses. Individual assistance is not designed to make one whole again. Usually IA, as we call it, is meant to meet immediate life needs. The maximum amount allowed is approximately a little over $30,000. For one who has lost their home, possibly with a mortgage, this amount falls short, usually to repair the damage, and the owner is left with this amount of damage to rebuild and a mortgage. This is why flood insurance is important. Federally backed flood insurance goes one step further and is double indemnity. As the map shows, flooding occurs often catastrophically outside the special flood hazard area. We as planners and floodplain administrators need to do two things. One, encourage people to purchase flood insurance even if they are not required by the mandatory purchase requirement, not in the special flood hazard area, or have paid off their mortgage with a mandatory purchase requirement. And two, encourage people who have been granted a letter of map amendment or letter of map revision to keep their flood insurance. Everyone is at some risk of flooding, and we need to protect ourselves against that risk and ensure we can become whole again. Preliminary damage assessments showed the same trend as the IA registrations. 71% occurred outside of the mapped floodplain. I can go on to say that I've also seen this trend in more recent disasters since Matthew. We are incurring flooding outside the mapped special flood hazard area. This requires us to change our thought processes. Often we say someone is outside the floodplain. We need to change our message to say that these individuals are in a lower risk area to incurring flooding. But as the data shows, they are still at a level of risk, and this risk needs to be protected against. The analysis of the storm goes one step further. We just learned that 70% of the flooding occurred outside the special flood hazard area. Data shows that in many locations, the storm surge was below or roughly equivalent to the 10% or 10-year event flood heights, indicating a higher frequency but lower risk event. What would the outcomes be if the event was the 1% or 100-year flood event? Development and permitting. Remember, all development in a special flood hazard area requires a permit, the jurisdiction's way of monitoring development. But what is development? 44 Code of Federal Regulations, which lists the minimum requirements to be met for a community to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and which makes federally backed flood insurance available to the citizens of the community, defines development as any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation or drilling operations, or storage of equipment and materials. One way to help with this floodplain management is the adoption and enforcement of building codes. The international codes, when properly adopted and enforced, will have an overall positive impact in reducing physical flood losses and other hazard losses. The study in 2013 requested by Congress confirmed the 2009, 2012, and 2015, and now the 2018 I codes meet or exceed the requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program. Virginia and many other states have adopted the I codes. Please make sure your jurisdiction, 1, adopts appropriate codes, and 2, cooperation is needed between the different regulatory agencies. to ensure cohesion and uniformity between different codes and ordinances. Building code, public works, planning, zoning, and emergency management, to name a few, all need to work together. This achieves a lot of things. One, the citizens receive one clear, concise, accurate message, and two, the force multipliers for enforcement. When a building inspector finds a violation, it may be able to be corrected in an efficient and thrifty manner, making for easy compliance and a happier citizen in the long run. Remember, it is our job to help ensure citizens comply with the regulations so that they suffer minimal damage, if any at all. Insurance impacts a freeboard a higher regulatory standard, but it lowers risk and premiums. If we look at a policy for a two-story single-family residence with no basement and a properly vented enclosure, the premium at the base flood elevation, the minimum height to be constructed to, would be $724 per year. That same home, if elevated with 1 foot of freeboard, would have a premium of $572. 2 feet of freeboard would be $475, a $249 savings over the year. These premiums relate to an AE zone designation with $250,000 worth of coverage and a $1,000 deductible. If we move that single-family primary residence to a VE zone or coastal zone, with the same coverage, $250,000 and a $1,000 deductible, the premium at BFE, or base flood elevation, would be $5,869 per year. 1 foot of freeboard, the premium would drop to $4,546, and 2 feet of freeboard, the premium falls to $3,252, a savings of $2,617 per year with just 2 feet of freeboard. Studies have shown that the expense of building with freeboard is offset by the savings in the insurance premiums over the life of a 30-year mortgage, saving money and reducing risk. We need to also consider other forms of mitigation to ensure the resiliency of our communities, along with adoption and proper enforcement of building codes, and elevation with additional freeboard, floodproofing, relocation of buildings to areas outside the high hazard areas, elevation of existing buildings, and communities can purchase high-risk properties through buyout programs, which may entail demolishing and possibly even rebuilding the structure to current codes and standards. Remember FRED, floodproof, relocate, elevate, and demolish, as options to help protect the mitigation flood losses. Communities also need to plan and consider stormwater facilities and long-term planning. Matthew overwhelmed the infrastructure in place and, as previously stated, only equated to a 10-year storm in many locations that saw devastating damage. Appropriately designed stormwater infrastructure that takes into account cumulative development, not just the development occurring on one specific site, needs to be addressed to prevent future losses. Maintenance of these new structures and existing structures also needs to be planned for. As existing infrastructure ages, quite possibly needing replaced or repaired, it often becomes a financial burden in many locations. How this is addressed needs to become a priority to protect against future losses. We also need to instill a culture of risk awareness in the public. This results in citizens being more open to mitigation measures, acceptable to codes and regulations, and hopefully the overall desire to not develop in flood-prone areas. This one task is the most important to ensure the other tasks are achieved. As awareness to risk grows, so the efforts for citizens to prepare for and mitigate against losses to the previously mentioned measures. This will also increase awareness that citizens need to insure their risk against potential losses. Conclusions: we need to prepare all citizens for the potential of flooding. The special flood hazard areas should not be our high-risk areas. Areas not mapped should be considered low risk. not no risk. Everyone needs to protect against these risks. Depending on individual assistance is not an acceptable means of managing that risk. People need to invest in flood insurance, and please keep in mind that many homeowners' policies do not cover losses from flooding. The more we do to reduce our risk equates to lower insurance premiums, but citizens still need to purchase flood insurance to protect themselves from the risk that is still present. We also need to convey that flood insurance pays claims even if it is not a federally designated disaster. So educate, prepare for, and insure against our risk.
All right, thank you, Charlie. Our next speaker is Mari Radford. Mari works with our risk analysis branch here at FEMA Region 3.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Michelle. So here's my number one message. You need to prepare for disasters before they happen. Post-disaster, you will have access to money, to better community understanding, and political will to mitigate and rebuild stronger and smarter. But it's going to be a whole lot easier if you've already done the legwork of developing tools, identifying opportunities, and establishing those partnerships with entities that are going to be helpful down the road. You may be familiar with the old rule of thumb that every dollar invested in mitigation has benefits of $4. Recently, the National Institute of Building Sciences Multi-Hazard Council released a new study that showed that mitigation truly has benefits closer to $7 for every dollar invested. If your community has had deaf ears when you've tried to talk to discuss mitigation and preventing problems before they happen, it's time to have that talk again with these new numbers. There are many ways you can build mitigation into your day-to-day decision-making, and with some of the tools we're going to highlight now. In order to get federal disaster assistance, all states must have an approved and adopted hazard mitigation plan that is updated every 5 years. This plan must include all natural hazards, but in today's world, they have been expanded to include man-made hazards as well. The plan analyzes hazards, which includes previous occurrences, risk, changing conditions, which could include climate change, the state's capabilities, and connects the state's goals, strategies, and actions to mitigate. The planning process is as much an output as the plan itself. It also may include the state's THIRA, or Threat Identification and Risk Assessment, which some of your communities may update on an annual basis. The Virginia State Plan was just adopted in March and will be valid now until 2023. Hazards profiled in it include communicable disease, drought, earthquake, flooding, impoundment failure, karst, landslide, land subsidence, non-rotational wind, solar storm, tornado, wildfire, and winter weather. All states may have a different spectrum of hazards. The Commonwealth will review the plan at least annually for needed changes and to track progress on identified actions. Post-disaster, this is one of the first references they will refer to target where to look for potential damage and identified mitigation strategies to address the risk. When Hurricane Matthew hit, the state had not begun their plan update. The timing allowed them to incorporate a new understanding of flood risk in the Hampton Roads area. So we have state hazard mitigation plans, but we also have local hazard mitigation plans. Localities also create and adopt hazard mitigation plans every 5 years for federal disaster assistance. Here in the Commonwealth, VDEM has supported the Planning District Councils, PDCs, to be the plan developer with or without contractor support. And this lessens the load on each individual community to facilitate a regional approach to planning. VDEM provides grant funding through FEMA's Pre-Disaster Mitigation, the PDM grant program, and Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. The former is annual and the latter is tied to a specific presidentially declared disaster. The PDC plans help inform the state plan with local understanding of risk and how that risk fits into the overall state strategy. Most local plans are now on their third or fourth iteration. Each update builds upon the previous plan with updated hazard events that are identified, a review of community capabilities, and how that risk has changed. These typically take 1 year to 18 months to plan, write, and approve. All communities must participate in the planning process to be eligible for FEMA approval. Each must also adopt the plan once it has been approved. The VDEM regional planners work with the PDCs during the planning process and are an excellent resource. FEMA will also offer technical assistance and training as the plan is being developed to ensure that the final plan meets regulatory requirements found in 44 CFR Part 201 and is a workable resource for the community. The Hampton Roads PDC 23 plan was already in draft form when Hurricane Matthew hit. And it was really a little too late to incorporate any other changes. Annual plan monitoring, though, allows them for changing priorities and opportunities to create any new amendments. You may also have heard about Moody's bond rating program and the fact that they are now looking at local hazard mitigation plans to ensure that they are not expired and incorporate future conditions such as climate change. This is another incentive to not allow communities to let their plans expire. So what is in a local hazard mitigation plan and who helps create it? Typically, it's a core planning team that's made up of county planners, emergency management officials, and GIS specialists. This may also include representatives from participating communities. The next layer is the stakeholder group, which includes additional local reps, along with businesses, utilities, governments, and nonprofit agencies, hospitals, schools, and any other sector that can add to the discussion. Building the right planning team and stakeholder group is key to a strong planning process and ultimately a plan that is well accepted and representative of the community. Some highlights in these plans include documenting plan integration opportunities. Your comprehensive plan, transportation plan, capital improvements plan, economic development plan, etc., should all speak to the hazard mitigation plan and vice versa. This can provide leverage for funding beyond FEMA grants and inform how identified hazards will impact these other planning mechanisms. National Flood Insurance Program data on policies and distribution of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties are also included in these plans. We encourage plans to include an analysis of structures in the special flood hazard area versus NFIP policies. What is the insurance coverage? Can these residents and business owners afford to rebuild without flood insurance? Mitigation actions could include insurance outreach. Identifying critical facilities at risk, using maps that overlay critical facilities in the special flood hazard area or areas of land subsidence or at risk of wildfire, help focus the conversation on where communities need to prioritize mitigation efforts, which could also include relocation. While most of our Virginia communities belong to the NFIP, only 9% of them belong to the community rating system. And in a time where flood insurance premiums are rising steadily, from 8% increases for owner-occupied homes annually up to 25% for other types of structures, joining the CRS is one of the very few things a community can do to lower the cost of flood insurance. The community rating system is a higher standards program that rewards communities that go above the minimums of the National Flood Insurance Program with flood insurance discounts, especially in the special flood hazard area. Discounts range from 5 to 45%, and the savings typically stay within the community. The administration of the program can be done by one person, but typically is a team approach that helps cross over the silos of floodplain management, building codes, zoning, planning, and outreach. The typical timeline to join the program is at least 2 years. An interested community must have a community assistance visit, a CAV, and resolve any outstanding compliance issues before a letter of good standing can be issued. The community can then apply to join and must document at least 500 points to be eligible for a Class 9. Elevation certificates are required for all construction development in the special flood hazard area, and mapping of repetitive loss areas and outreach may be required. In Virginia, we currently have 25 CRS communities. We also have 2 active CRS user groups, one in Northern Virginia and one in the Hampton Roads area, where Hurricane Matthew hit. User groups collaborate on shared projects. They share tips and tricks for cycle visits and annual certifications, and they also help with program tracking and documentation ideas. Both user groups welcome current CRS communities and those interested in learning more about the program. Participants include floodplain managers, planners, building officials, public information officers, and nonprofits like Wetlands Watch and other community officials. If you're interested in learning more about the impacts of CRS in Virginia, Wetlands Watch recently completed a cost-benefit analysis of the program entitled The Costs and Benefits of the CRS Program in Virginia. Some of the big takeaways in their study was CRS communities experienced 38% less insured flood damage in special flood hazard areas compared to non-CRS communities. And CRS communities experienced 36% less insured flood damage outside of the special flood hazard area. This all comes back to good public outreach on flood risk and strong floodplain management programming. The Hampton Roads area has 5 of their 16 communities that participated in the hazard mitigation plan that participate in CRS. Sometimes you need help with mitigation projects but don't know who to approach. The Silver Jackets program was developed to overcome our many agency and organizational silos. In Virginia, we chartered back in December 2010, and our common goal is flood mitigation. We have a state-led team. We coordinate solutions with state flood risk management priorities. We coordinate and leverage available resources and information between the agencies, and we facilitate state-level life cycle planning to reduce flood risk. Some examples of some of the projects we've worked on in Virginia include a high watermark campaign with the City of Richmond, forecast point development on the James River at Richmond Locks, blackwater inundation mapping and forecast point development. And right now we're in the middle of developing a flood risk guide for local Virginia officials. We also are kicking off a Lower Peninsula mitigation tournament this summer in the Hampton Roads area. Members include the 5 U.S. Army Corps of Engineers districts that service Virginia. That includes Wilmington, Nashville, Huntington, Baltimore, and Norfolk. But the membership in the Virginia Silver Jackets also includes the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, DCR, FEMA, USGS, NOAA, and the USDA. Let us know if you have a project idea. We're always looking for more. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mari. There's a couple of resources that Mari put here on the presentation that you can always go to later to check out. With that, Kevin Snyder and I are going to round it off talking a little bit about recovery planning and resources. We're going to talk about pre- and post-disaster recovery planning, the role of the community, and we're going to talk a little bit about what the state of Virginia is doing. I'm going to turn over to Kevin Snyder. He's the Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator with FEMA. He's currently deployed to Puerto Rico to support a lot of the efforts going on down there. With that, Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for taking some time to listen in here. So why is recovery complex? Well, communities are complex, and as planners, we inherently know this. That's just part of our training and our practice. But what we see with disasters is, an acute impact to one of the many interconnected components of the communities that we work with. And not only do we see the impacts within that component, but then there are cascading impacts that will spill across the other elements of the community. And so, it quickly becomes, a situation that requires a greater level of effort and coordination. So next slide, please. And that's why we have the National Disaster Recovery Framework. It recognizes that recovery efforts require greater coordination across not just the federal family, but the whole of community. So federal, state, and local governments working together, in addition to nonprofit entities, philanthropic community, the private sector, because of that very complexity that a recovery process presents for a local community. Within the National Disaster Recovery Framework, you'll find some guidance guidance and training, kind of common doctrine. It helps to define roles, and it establishes a coordination structure for us at the federal level and suggests the structures for the state and local level. Next slide, please. this is a required graphic in any recovery-related presentation, the recovery continuum. And there are many takeaways from this, some that tie into Mari and Robbie's presentation and Charlie's presentation on the preparedness side and the importance of flood insurance and developing hazard mitigation plans and having those things in place. For me, one of the other key takeaways here is that on that green wave that you see, the long-term recovery effort, you can see it starts early on in the short term, in the days after the event. And so it's a recognition that amidst all of the chaos of early response efforts, there will be decisions that are made that are going to have long-term impact. And so, it's going to be to the benefit of everyone involved, to the local community, to have your eye on those decisions, to have somebody that can speak for recovery early on, or a group of people, better yet, to speak for recovery early on to help influence those decisions so that the community can make for a more resilient recovery longer term. Next slide, please. So there are three key concepts that the NDRF promotes. One is leadership at every level. So just a little bit of background, the NDRF comes from the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. So there was a requirement from Congress that the federal government, at the time they called it just a strategy, but write a strategy for how we would support recovery efforts long term. And one of the things that we learned from Katrina was that there needed to be better leadership structures in place at the federal, state, and local levels in order to coordinate recovery efforts. In addition to that, the second key concept is the framework establishes the recovery support function coordination structure. So not just the leadership, but how do we bring together and organize the various governmental departments and agencies that can bring resources to bear to aid recovery efforts. So the framework establishes that structure at the federal level. And then it advocates, the third key concept, it advocates strongly for preparedness, resilience, and mitigation through, as Michelle mentioned, both pre and post disaster recovery planning. So there are actions that you can take before an event that are going to benefit your recovery efforts and your ability to build resilience or enhance resilience within your community. And then there are separate and distinct actions that you can take post-disaster to make for a more efficient and effective recovery. Next slide, please. This is how we are organized at the federal level. We have 6 recovery support functions: community planning and capacity building, economic recovery, health and social services, housing, infrastructure, and then natural and cultural resources. Each of those has a designated coordinating agency, and that's who you see on the right-hand side there, their symbol. And then there are primary and supporting agencies that all have, a piece of the pie there, a piece of the solution set for those functional areas. But this isn't, hard and fast. So we need to be flexible. As part of what the NDRF promotes is a scalable and flexible structure. So, for example, as Michelle mentioned, I'm in Puerto Rico right now, and just the enormity of the scale of the impacts and the complexity, the incredible complexity here, we recognize that within infrastructure systems, that's too big of a bucket. So we've broken out into different functional sectors, water, energy, communications, and a few others, to help better manage the recovery, just given the complexity here. And I point that out because we have veered a little bit from what the guidance says here in Puerto Rico for the betterment of the Commonwealth, but you'll also see it in state and local plans, different recovery support function structures because just of the nature of what their risks are or the way that their government is organized. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the key components or the key elements of the NDRF was pre-disaster recovery planning. So we will often ask ourselves, why should we spend time writing a pre-disaster recovery plan? We all operate in an environment where we have limited resources. And so, why is it important to have this in place at a local, state, and even the federal level? Well, one, it avoids those ad hoc processes. listening to Robbie's retelling of his experience post-Hurricane Matthew, and even Mari's first point about preparedness on the front end, you can see we don't want to be making these things up as we go, right? We want to do what we can to have structures, procedures, roles, and responsibilities in place so that then we can focus on the real issues that a disaster presents for the community. The second point is that it's going to help ensure that we get the public input that is required for writing, a good post-disaster recovery plan. Make sure that's sustainable and it's implemented in the long run. And there will be a tendency post-event, amidst everything that's going on, to maybe cut that out, that public engagement out, or limit it some. And so if you have a well-written pre-disaster recovery plan, I think you're more likely to get that public engagement that you should have for your recovery effort. It establishes clear leadership roles, so we talked a little bit about the importance of that. I won't reiterate it. It does help us speed the identification of both needs, so related to the disaster impacts and maybe even some pre-existing trends or pre-existing needs in the community, and then the resources that can help address those needs. So the sooner you can start to scope out what the issues are and your strategies for addressing them, the sooner you can start to identify those resources that may be available. And with the kind of higher profile disasters, you'll see more resources brought to bear from outside the federal government, and you want to be able to tap those effectively, and having a pre-disaster recovery plan in place will help you do that. And then it's going to help you maximize those opportunities to build resilience and mitigation, just because you're organized, you know how you're going to talk to one another, the procedures you're going to use to do that, how you're going to establish priorities, identify issues, and then you're going to really be able to key in on, all right, what do we do here to enhance our resilience? How are we going to build back better in the long term? And then just finally, it helps to improve the coordination between your local, state, and federal partners. Next slide, please. All right, so since we're talking Virginia, we thought we would spend a little bit of time talking about the Virginia Recovery Annex that they are writing right now. The Commonwealth of Virginia is I would say they're updating their pre-disaster recovery plan. They have one in place, and this is a real maturation of what was in place before. The bullets here sort of shroud the plan in the mystery of emergency management jargon, but just know that what they are writing is dead center pre-disaster recovery plan. They do all the things that we just identified on the slide before about why you would prepare one in the plan. And so they're out in front of many other states across the country. Not all states have one of these in place, and Virginia is doing a good job of it. Next slide, please. This just reflects the different plan components that contribute to the statewide recovery annex. So they have a base plan, and in that is a recovery and mitigation standard operating guide. Then they have the various emergency support functions, which you probably are familiar with to some extent, and support annexes, and then they have some hazard-specific annexes that speak to the risks that the Commonwealth of Virginia faces. All of those contribute and inform the statewide recovery annex. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about the development here. Back to the engagement piece, the importance of engagement. They established a core planning team, and from July to March of this year, July last year, March of this year, they worked to develop the base annex. And I think it's important to point out here at this step that their effort goes way outside of just the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. There's a real recognition and embracing that recovery requires the whole community, and they've had extensive engagement with their state level partners, but also their local level partners to make sure they get input into the plan. And develop that sort of ownership of it outside of the emergency management community, because it won't be long after an event that the focus and the role of the emergency management community will diminish some as other players, the housing department or a Department of Commerce or Economic Development or the planning department, start to play an increased role with the recovery effort. So their pre-disaster recovery planning effort in Virginia recognizes this. They're built into the plan. They all have contributed to the writing of the plan and identified the roles that they'll play post disaster. Next slide, please. So an earlier point I made about how the NDRF is scalable and flexible, and that it doesn't prescribe the structure for the state. This demonstrates this very well. We have, I think it's a dozen RSFs for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and this just shows how they would match up with our recovery support function. So we will adapt to whatever structure is in place at a state or a local level. The real focus is on developing solutions to the issues that the disaster presents. And these organizational structures here are what we think are the best ways to develop those solutions, but it may require additional partners or a rethinking about how we're organized, and the framework and the Commonwealth's plan are both flexible enough to do that. Next slide, please. It wouldn't be a FEMA presentation without an org chart. So here's the notional org chart about how it shows how the federal organization will coordinate and match up with the Commonwealth's organization. And you can see our 6 RSFs over there with the Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator at the top, sort of managing them and leading their efforts, and a similar structure on the left-hand side in the Virginia plan. And I think that's all I have right now. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, talk a little bit about recovery planning guidance.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So I'm very hopeful that hearing us talk for the past hour about, flooding and risk and hazards really has you thinking that if your community doesn't already have a plan, that you'd really like to know what you need to do to go about creating one. So I wanted to share with you a couple of the resources we have for both pre and post disaster recovery planning, and we've got some really, really, really great tools and resources available. So FEMA developed a series of 3 planning guidances, and they're designed to help the locals, the states, and the territories prepare for recovery. These are 2 of the guidance documents. One, as you see on the left here, focuses on pre-disaster recovery planning guide for local governments. We also have one for state governments, and we're currently in the process of developing the 3rd one, which is focused on tribal governments. And the purpose of these documents is really to provide, outline some of the steps and techniques that locals and state governments can take as they recover from disasters, so that they can be prepared to ensure that they have a smooth transition. Some of the differences between the local guide and the state guide is that the local document really focuses on local leadership and the needs that are specific to communities, while the state document really focuses more on the delivery of resources to the localities and more of that coordination and supporting piece. But, we have a lot of planners on the line. They really do outline the traditional planning process of how you want to ensure that you are meeting these planning priorities that Kevin talked about, how you can go about forming a collaborative planning team that really represents a wide group of stakeholders, the kind of research that you want to do in the background, understanding the situation so that you can ensure that you're addressing the hazards and some of the pre-existing conditions of your community, working to determine those goals and objectives for your plan and how best you can, develop those courses of action. And then there's a little bit of guidance on how you're going to actually develop that plan, what that plan can look like, and going into the implementation process. A really big focus I want to highlight about these guidance is that they really talk a lot about plan integration and share best practices and resources. So if your community already has hazard mitigation plans or emergency operations plans, transportation plans, economic development plans, this really helps to provide you with an understanding of how you can coordinate and consolidate those plans. This doesn't have to be a standalone document. Especially with communities that have limited capacity, we're not trying to tell you to develop a new document that's a pre-disaster plan, but really how to think across the broader scope of plans that you have and how you can integrate the priorities that they outline into a document that's going to help you be prepared. So another document I want to talk about is the effective coordination of recovery resources, and this document is for states, tribes, and local governments. And this, again, the intended audience for this document is states, tribes, and locals, but this is really designed to be applied after an incident occurs, and it helps you to, identify what some of those post-disaster needs are and how to best strategize and implement your disaster recovery. It doesn't mean that you can't use it pre-disaster, but it's really designed to help you enhance your planning efforts so that you can get a seamless transition into that post-disaster recovery phase and very quickly identify your partners, your roles, and your resources, and really to prioritize what your needs are going to be. So I added this one slide here just to kind of show a little bit of the difference in the guidances between that pre-incident planning and post-incident. And if you're looking at the middle here at these bullets, pre-incident planning, as Kevin really alluded to earlier, is going to help you identify what that leadership structure is going to look like, who has a seat at the table, what are the roles and responsibilities of those agencies, and what are some of those potential issues and resources that you're going to want to identify before disaster hits. When you focus on the post-disaster planning, that's where you're really going to try to identify what your strategies are going to look like and how you're going to move forward with implementing them. And this is where you're going to focus on those recovery projects. This is where, the disasters occurred and you're trying to identify how are you going to go about making this community whole again? How are you going to focus on coordinating and what are some of those longer term priorities that we are going to be focusing on? And finally, I just wanted to provide you some of the resources we have online. FEMA's developed a community recovery management toolkit. I strongly encourage everybody to go to this website. What it is it's basically an online toolkit with over 200 varied resources that provide a lot of information for various stakeholders. We have it identified into multiple parts. So the first part kind of focuses on organizing recovery, organizing your structure. Who needs to have a seat at the table? How are you going to be engaging communities? What that public communication is going to look like? We have best practices. We've got peer-to-peer resources, leadership videos. We've got guidance documents. We're going to talk about, planning and managing are some of the other tools. And there's just a number of great case studies and examples to share with you. And focusing particularly on managing resources, there's some really great examples of disaster resource tools that provide information about how would you staff up post-disaster? What is that financial structure going to look like? Again, more guides and case studies. And finally, in the post-disaster environment with Harvey, Irma, with Maria in Puerto Rico and a number of the other disasters we have across state, the website has now added a recovery training section, and this section kind of provides the user with ongoing trainings that we have available. A lot of communities are now going through this post-disaster climate for the first time ever, so we wanted to make sure that we were constantly updating the resources that are available online. So I strongly encourage you to, go back to this presentation, which will be posted. We all have provided some really great links, and hopefully that'll give you some time to really digest this information. So just some conclusions from, we've all had some conclusion slides, but, focusing on what Kevin and I talked about, some of the things that I really want you to maybe think about, after this presentation is over is that, disasters are complex. We talked about that. But thinking about your community and your jurisdiction, who would the right people be that you would want to have communicate in your community? If traditionally emergency management or maybe your public safety sector has been where the focus is primarily laid on working with emergency management, would that really be the case in the post-disaster climate? Maybe it's your housing agencies or your economic development agencies or your planning, your planning agencies at whatever community or private sector level you work in. Also, how does the state that you're in, how does it coordinate with the localities? How have they focused on the recovery efforts? And would there be any challenges if you're, regionally across community levels? And also, how do you weigh the development goals that you currently have with those post-disaster needs? And also, what is the role that you can do in building statewide consensus and focusing on recovery priorities? So hopefully you've had this time to listen to us talk for a while, and it's going to give you some food for thought to go back and think about, if you haven't really worked closely in a post-disaster environment or really put a lot of focus pre-disaster, what are the things that you may want to do to kind of move the needle forward in your community? So with that, I'm going to leave this last slide up that has all of our contact information and our roles, and I'm going to turn it back over to Christine to take some questions. And you know, thank you so much for taking this time to hear us talk about what we do. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Okay, we're just going to jump right in because we do have quite a few questions coming in. And folks, feel free to ask your questions. If we don't get to them, you can reach out directly to the panelists. And also just very quickly, again, this webcast is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. And we will have a PDF of the presentation available on our webcast webpage at the conclusion today, which is ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Okay, so first question. Let's have Robbie answer this one. And then if anyone else has any comments, they can chime in. I am from Florida and our county was hit harder by Matthew than Irma. How was reimbursement in Virginia?
Well, from Matthew, we've been pretty successful in our reimbursements for public assistance payouts. It's been almost a year and a half. I think we've paid out 60% or so of that disaster. Again, relatively small in nature compared to Florida. The PA amounts in total in Virginia was, on the federal side, about 14 million. So we are kind of wrapping up our final touches on documentation to submit our last few projects to FEMA for a review. But so far it's trending better than, with our refined processes, it's trending better here.
Great, thank you. This next question, I think it's Charlie. What do you mean exactly by freeboard? Is it relative to elevation or feature? Was that you who was talking about that?
Yes, ma'am. Freeboard is elevation in excess of above the base flood elevation. So you go above and beyond that base flood elevation with extra elevation of the structure, and that equates to freeboard.
Okay, thank you. Let's have Kevin touch on this one. How can the notions of mitigation and resilience be linked for community security as Virginians begin to experience more effects of climate disruption?
Good question. I think Mari's probably going to want to chime in on this as well, too. I think post-event, you know, there's opportunities for the resources that are available. So it's public assistance, it's the mitigation dollars, it could be, you know, nonprofit dollars. It's even with the insurance, the NFIP disbursements are often the largest dollar disbursements after a disaster event, depending on the insurance rate in that community. But so having, you know, plans in place and guidance available for those rebuilding or reconstruction efforts, they don't have to be disaster-specific plans, but they're just local community policies to, you know, address sea level rise or climate change or the changing risk landscape, basically, that the community faces. If those things are, I think, in place and sort of thought through ahead of time, you're going to be able to build them into the efforts that come after the event and to help guide and shape the way that public assistance dollars and mitigation dollars and other disaster recovery dollars are spent. I don't know, Mari, you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I was just going to mention this Moody's report again. Having an organization like Moody's looking at community impacts with climate change, future conditions, really whether they are embracing their own risk, and that would include adopting hazard mitigation plans in a timely manner. That is a new facet we have not been aware of before, and it's one that we know that the Hampton Roads communities are particularly looking at very closely. When we spoke with Virginia Beach a couple of weeks ago, we were told that, you know, almost all their decision making came back to how this might impact the perception of their community, as a place to invest in, a place to live and grow in. And that really should be resonating with communities across America. They should be thinking that way.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'll just kind of leave this one up and whoever wants to grab at it. Are there any proposals to increase flood insurance coverage? Also, $30,000 for ICC increased cost of compliance seems like almost a deterrent for many property owners. Is there a plan to increase that as well?
Yeah, I'll field these. Yes, we do want to increase the coverage of flood insurance as far as who obtains it. I mean, realistically, as I said, everyone is at some level of risk, so therefore everyone should have a flood insurance policy. As far as the increased cost of compliance, they are looking at upping that dollar amount for that, knowing that it's not covering the retrofit or the mitigation measure for lessening the risk on that structure. So that's being discussed.
This is Mari. I'll just dive in too. Remember too that any participating community, any community that participates in the NFIP has access to flood insurance. You don't have to be in the special flood hazard area. You can get a policy no matter where you are. Now there are caps with how much we can cover, but again, that coverage is available to any NFIP participating community.
Thank you. Next one, what federal strategic actions are being taken to prepare for chronic long-term coastal flooding that by all accounts will likely be the norm 20 to 50 years from now?
This is Mari. I'll dive in, and then I'm sure somebody else has something to add to this. Remember, disasters are local first. Communities are approaching this very much on a one-by-one basis. And what really makes Hampton Roads kind of different is that they are really joining forces and looking at how this is going to impact the region. We know that as sea level rise continues, and we're already seeing the impacts in the Norfolk, Hampton Roads area, that it's driving people to make different decisions about where they work, where they live, how they get to their jobs. And so really, regional approaches seem to be the fastest way to address this. And then we're following along and trying to offer as much assistance as we can as federal entities.
And I'll add to that, a lot of that goes into making those citizens aware of not just immediate risk, but the risk long term. What's the potential impacts of other development, sea level rise, whatever that risk may be coming from. We need to get out there and have that public better prepared to face these risks and mitigate them prior to the event and be better prepared.
Okay, thank you. Someone had asked a question and I just accidentally deleted it, but it was good. It was something to do with the time span between when funds are administered and when people actually receive them. So whoever that is, if you could ask that question one more time, because I'm pretty sure there was something a little more specific to that. Next thing is, it's really more of a comment. I was a contractor for disaster 1763 in Iowa and worked with emergency support function recovery planners. Besides the community recovery toolkit that was developed through those disasters and subsequent disasters in Texas, some of the different level of disaster plans can probably be found online. And other than that, unless that one person types back in with that question that I accidentally deleted, I think we can probably wrap things up, unless anyone has any comments about that kind of that time span in between. I'm not really sure what the question was. And I don't see them typing it back in. So I guess with that, we have 3 minutes to spare. So if there aren't any other final comments that our presenters have, I would just like to thank them all for joining us today. This was a really great panel, and particularly those that are calling in from outside of the U.S., so thank you. And to the Virginia chapter for sponsoring today's webcast, thanks. And again, this webcast is recording and it'll be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll have a PDF copy available shortly on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So hey, everyone, have a really great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.